Here's something that most transformation conversations get fundamentally wrong. They assume that transformation is something that organizations do when they're struggling, when the market shifts, when the numbers decline, when the board starts asking uncomfortable questions. But there's a form of transformation that is far more psychologically complex than a turnaround, and it happens inside organizations that are succeeding. It's the transformation that growth itself demands. Because growth does not just change the numbers, it changes the identity of the organization. It changes what people were hired to do. It changes the implicit promises that were made about what working here would feel like. It changes the decision-making speed that the culture can tolerate. And it changes the relationship between the people who built the thing and the thing that it's becoming. Every stage of growth creates a new crisis that can't be solved with the approach that produced the original growth. And yet, well, the instinct of every leader inside that growth is to do more of what is working while not recognizing that what has and is working is about to become the biggest constraint. I'm Kevin Novak, CEO of 2040 Digital, professor at the University of Maryland, and author of the book, The Truth About Transformation, Leading in the Age of AI, Uncertainty, and Human Complexity, along with the Ideas and Innovations weekly newsletter. Welcome to the Human Factor Podcast, the show that explores the intersection of humanity, technology, and transformation, along with the psychology behind transformation success. This is season 2. Today's guest, well, he spent 20 years inside the pressures of scaling organizations, not theorizing about it, not consulting on it from the outside, actually building and operating inside organizations during the most intense periods of growth. From a startup that achieved 16 times top-line growth before being acquired by 3M, to the international expansion strategy that contributed directly to a $1.2 billion acquisition. He has been the person in the room when growth outpaces the organization's capacity to absorb it, when the culture that attracted early employees starts to fracture under the weight of new arrivals, and when the systems that produce success at one stage become the obstacles at the next. Mike Peroni is a revenue and go-to-market leader who has operated across startup, growth, and enterprise contexts. He has served as chief operating officer at Hypervent Systems. He then served as COO at Content Raven during the early stage startup phase. And most recently, he built ETQ's first indirect sales channel and international expansion as VP of EMEA sales, work that contributed to Hexagon's $1.2 billion acquisition of the organization. Not bad. What makes Mike's perspective uniquely valuable for this conversation is not just the growth that he's driven. It is the pattern recognition that comes from having been inside the human dynamics of scaling across multiple organizations at different stages. He has seen what breaks when an organization scales faster than its people can adapt. He has seen how early traction gets misread, how organizational identity cracks under the pressure of success, and how the very capabilities that create growth become the constraints that prevent the next stage of evolution. And, well, he has recently been articulating those patterns publicly. He's been arguing that in the AI era, feature-based differentiation is dead, and that the only defensible advantage is proprietary insight data or execution velocity that compounds over time. Those are human systems. Mike Welcome to the Human Factor Podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Kevin.
I want to start with something that most growth stage leaders never see coming because research predicts it, but the experience of being inside the growth makes it nearly invisible. In 1972, Larry Greiner published a paper in Harvard Business Review called Evolution and Revolution as Organizations Grow. It's one of the most cited papers in organizational development research. Greiner demonstrated that organizations don't grow smoothly. They pass through distinct stages, and each stage ends not with a gradual transition, but with a crisis of leadership, a crisis of autonomy, a crisis of control, a crisis of red tape. The critical insight is that each crisis is produced by the success of the previous stage. The management approach that created the growth is the same approach that creates the current crisis. The founder's vision that launched the organization becomes the bottleneck when it needs delegation. The delegation that freed the organization to scale creates coordination problems that demand completely new systems. The systems that created the order become bureaucracy that stifles innovation. You have been through multiple stages of this cycle, Mike, across Hypervent, Content Raven, and ETQ. Where have you seen human dynamics of growth surprise leaders the most? Not the strategic challenges, but the people dynamics. The moments when the organization that the people joined is no longer the organization they are inside, and the approach that got them there stops working.
Like most things, Kevin, there's good and bad, right? Positive and negative that comes from these situations. If we shift our focus to the challenges, there's a ton of standard human behavior that you can almost predict in terms of what you'll get for resistance or, the challenges in organizing a group of people towards change to some sort of destination. And so, when I am in an organization where my job is to affect and lead through change, I'm very quickly trying to understand where the resistance is. There's always this kind of resistance. And sometimes it can be disbelief, right? I don't believe we can get where we're going. I don't believe these actions will get us there, right? People have opinions and beliefs. And so I first try to understand where people's belief systems are. That's the most challenging, right? And I think you even see it in today's, let's call it political climate, where there's this bias towards confirmation. And so when people have a belief, they tend to go look for things that support that, and they reject things that are contrary to that. So I generally put a big spotlight on that, and it becomes really clear where that resistance lies, where there is disbelief. Maybe it varies from person to person, but generally speaking, if you go through a process of understanding and getting them to admit out loud what their beliefs or disbeliefs are, but then you can better align the collective objective you have to their personal objectives. That's where I see beliefs start to change, right? Where you can actually penetrate that shield of this is my belief system, and therefore I'm going to do everything consistent with that and nothing inconsistent with that.
So how have you seen, Mike, how have you seen leaders handle that situation? So are there, and it's actually got two questions there. So are there different techniques that you use to help break down that resistance to better understand from people what that resistance is?
Yeah, great question. I think the very first thing that I've seen effective leaders do is work really hard, but also patiently to ensure the vision, right? The so called destination is crystal clear to a person. And then once that is clear, and you will I've seen them ask, and I've done this myself, start to solicit help, right? So here's the vision. Here's what I think we should do first. You bring everyone together and you lead the discussion towards how we're going to do this, right? Both being a bit of authoritative, right?
Mhm.
I'm kind of the final judge and jury here, but also being very open to hearing different ideas and leveraging different perspectives among your team, right? And I think that that does set the right tone with everyone. One, we're doing this. Two, we do need to be very pragmatic about it. It's not about wild swings or big strategies, which, frankly, some people like to do. So bringing them down to a more grounded approach, and then listening to the ideas and not necessarily quickly accepting or shutting them down, but to foster discussion. And I think a really strong leader is going to be very aware of where the room is emotionally, right? Is this scary? Is this exciting? Is it a mix of both? And then start to lead everyone towards that kind of set of actions you think is going to make the group successful. And you'll start to hear where there are perhaps better ideas. People are leaning in to actually focus on the problem creatively. You'll also recognize where people seem to be leaning in through hard questions and challenges, but based on how effective those questions are, you'll know if they're resistant or not,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So I've seen that as the really good start, right? Is to establish that framework. Here's how we're going to have the discussion. Here's what's non-negotiable. One, we're doing it. Two, the vision. If you want to make it better, go for it. I'm open to ideas, but the vision's the vision. So let's rally behind that. And then, uh, and of course, ensure it's grounded in a strong why for the business, and perhaps start to tie that to some professional growth that everyone can experience.
Well, yeah, because a couple episodes ago with Ryan Vet talking about Gen Z particularly, one of their biggest needs is to understand the why. So they're good with authority, but they also they feel that they need to understand the why so they themselves can rally behind it and better understand it. So that's always an important point.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's important to find your motivator to do anything, right? And so, as a leader, it is important that you head down that path to help people find their motivation. Why is the best place to start? And then I think people will naturally start to apply that to their own personal why. How do these things align?
Hmm.
Um, and I do find that breaking off into more individual conversations after that is important because you can help people that maybe there is a gap between the kind of group why and the personal why. Um, it also helps. One of the outcomes of this kind of early step, Kevin, is that you start to find that small group of champions, right? Of the core group that wants to propel this forward. And you may have people on the periphery that are going to either resist or be slow to
Hmm.
join, but
Hmm.
establishing that core group and letting it come up naturally.
Hmm.
Who it works for in terms of motivation, who it works for in terms of where they are in life, but just let that happen naturally. That group is a tide that lifts all ships. And so you can double down on that segment of the group to help them connect that to their kind of personal motivators, personal whys early on, and that really does kind of take on a life of its own.
So, Mike, to the resistance. So, one of the things that I talk a lot about, I write a lot about, is Denise Rousseau's research on the psychological contract of employment.
Okay.
And so, just as some information here, every employment relationship contains an unwritten set of mutual expectations. And that goes far beyond the job description or the compensation package. people then join, and back to the comment about even Gen Z, they join because they're seeking some alignment to the organization and the value that are aligned with their own values as an individual. So they join with implicit beliefs about what the culture will feel like, how decisions will be made, what their role will mean, and what growth looks like for them personally. So when an organization scales rapidly and a go to market transformation change, those implicit contracts are violated constantly,
Yeah.
like not through anyone's intention, but through the structural reality that the organization is changing faster than the promises that made can be maintained. So, as someone who has lived through this several times across your career, how have you navigated the dynamic inside organizations that you've scaled?
Yeah. Great question. Fundamentally, I think it's built on culture, right? And I don't mean kind of fluffy culture. I mean very specific. Here's what we believe are the behaviors that will lead us as a group to success, right? And then ensuring that and holding accountable the team to those behaviors, but also making sure they have the tools and the access that they need to execute on that. And I think once it does eliminate a lot of the ambiguity that can exist in these unwritten contracts. And I find that happens a lot in personal relationships, not just business relationships. So it's a very helpful skill to have.
Yeah.
But being able to communicate the behaviors that make it and tying it directly to success, right? So, I come from a go to market world. I've done operations before, um, but generally very revenue oriented. And so the cultures I've built have been in maybe almost all, but there's probably a few outliers. In almost all circumstances, I'm trying to build a culture of performance, right? And then obviously performance then allows people to take the success at work and then apply it in some way appropriate to them into their personal life, right?
Mhm.
Success should be personal. It shouldn't be an obligation that you work for company you're doing it. Of course that is true, but when the team starts to see the performance as a benefit to their personal lives, or whether it's to care for your family or to travel or whatever it means to you. Once you tie that together, which often the group will start to do on their own, a culture emerges. And as a leader, it's important to find ways to make that attainable. This call it SMART goals, right? It's got to be specific. You've got to be able to like know if you're doing it or not. It should be kind of time based, but there's also a set of behaviors that I usually call non-negotiables, right? This isn't me being authoritative. This is saying this is what we believe as a group are the behaviors that will lead to success. Therefore, we're going to hold ourselves accountable.
So Mike, to a question around that, and as you're coming in and helping a company grow, right, and to earlier point that I made, where an organization is what it is and related to its processes and so forth, and all of that is why they got to where they're at.
Yeah,
But now they want to excel. So the wheels may fall off the car because new wheels need to be put on to go faster or to be more adept. So how how do you manage the changes related to what that performance was versus what the expectations of performance now are?
yeah. It starts with transparency and documenting it. And usually, what you'll find is once you establish what good looks like, or perhaps in this case, what the new good looks like,
Hmm. Hmm.
um, that's change. period. And change for many is very difficult. And so I think being very transparent about what the opportunity is, that's based in realism, what the challenges and risks are, but also to start to separate what we have control over, i.e., we should focus on, from what we don't have control over. So let's not spend time there.
Mhm.
So I have found as a tactic, separating signal from noise is an area people need help in, but also in that clarity of direction does minimize the, let's call it, the internal turbulence that one can experience, right? So that that's kind of how I approach that, right? Very transparent about what the current state is. Very transparent about the challenges and sometimes the risks that stand between us and that success that we all
Mhm.
want to achieve.
Mhm.
And then that can serve as an onslaught of things we should do, and being able to prioritize those and do it with the team so they have a sense of ownership is how I manage those situations where we are setting new performance goals. We are setting new activity expectations that we believe will lead to those. We are setting behavior standards that we are going to be disciplined and accountable to a person, including myself. And so that layer of transparency helps you achieve, and clarity help you achieve that. But people also take personal responsibility for it. You don't want to manage through these periods, you want to lead.
Mhm.
And of course, some management is required, but when you give people the tools to be self-directed in concert with the goals and in concert with all of these standard operating behaviors that we've agreed to, people can then stop worrying about that, and then they put their focus on what they're perhaps uniquely qualified for. And so now they're accretive to the process versus being more of a drag where you're trying to pull them with you.
Mhm.
And so that's, that, I mean, just really,
So,
really
Mike,
straightforward, Kevin.
do you find that so as you're seeking the scale, right? Seeking the scale companies, and there's a lot of change, and there's maybe often acceleration of those changes. Are are there people that get lost in that process? Are there people that simply wind up unable to shift from that early stage, in many ways mid stability, to another round of growth, that they sort of throw their hands up and like, okay, I'm done.
Yeah. Short answer is yes. People do get left behind, unfortunately. Sometimes that's a function of the change. There's no longer a fit, right? So you could take today's kind of AI context.
Hmm.
Roles are changing very rapidly. And so perhaps there isn't a new role for you in an organization, and you do get left behind despite your good intentions and attitudes. However, what I find is the people that get left behind are the ones that have some sort of fixed mindset. They're not they're trying to prevent the change, or they're trying to
Hmm.
hide from the change
Hmm.
versus embracing it and then ultimately finding their way to influence it in an aligned way. Good for the company, good for my boss, good for my peers, and really good for me. And so
Hmm.
now I'm going to push it in this direction. And if you have a kind of fixed mindset on that, the chances of you getting left behind are much higher.
So let me shift into something that I think Mike relates. So you've been writing publicly that it connects directly to identity, that we talk a lot about. I talk on the show. I talk a lot about it in my writing. So you've argued that feature-based differentiation is no longer a defensible moat in the AI era.
Yeah.
That capability, which once took months to build, can now be replicated in days. And that only sustainable advantage is proprietary insight, data, or execution velocity that compounds over time.
Yeah.
So that argument is presented as a market strategy. You're obviously a go-to-market guy, but underneath it is one of the most profound organizational identity challenges any company can face. And Clayton Christensen's research on the innovator's dilemma demonstrated that organizations develop capabilities, processes, and values that define who they are. And those three elements become precisely what prevents them from adapting to disruptive change.
Yeah.
Capabilities are embedded in what the organization knows how to do. And to your point, people become fixed mindset because they're so embedded in those processes. And the values are embedded in what it decides it's worth doing. So when disruption arrives, you come in as the go-to market guy who's about to scale the business. All three elements are conspiring to keep the organization doing what it's always done because that is what its identity is built around. So when you tell an organization that their product features are no longer their moat, you're not just delivering a strategic insight, right? You're threatening their organizational identity.
Yeah.
You're telling them that the thing they believe made them special no longer makes them special.
Yeah.
So how have you seen organizations respond to that kind of identity threat and individuals as well? And what does the response reveal about the relationship between identity and the capacity for transformation?
Yeah. Great question. And let me preface it with we're in early days here as the software industry transforms in the era of AI. So I don't state these things as absolute conviction, rather, the foundation from which we can all start to learn. So I think it's not a surprise to many organizations that differentiation is changing and that the software industry as a whole is changing. So we therefore must adapt. So a bit of a unique situation in this one, Kevin, because I think people are braced for it, right? However, I've been meeting with CEOs and founders from AI companies and SaaS companies that are, have agentic or some other type of AI capability, ML, et cetera.
Yeah.
And it's been a mix, but I have recognized a little pattern as to their response, and it's seems very correlated to the maturity of the company, right? So younger companies that are really at the start of building their customer base, I think they've already adopted this identity that we are going to differentiate differently. We're going to try to find a new way to solve an existing business problem better, faster, cheaper. And so a lot of ideas are and trends are emerging from that. Larger companies where they have an install base, and these are folks that I've spoken to. And these are leaders, right? So it's not
Hmm.
necessarily the folks in the organization, but
Hmm.
leaders are a bit more cautious and
Hmm.
questioning, rightfully so. And in
Hmm.
fact, some of the best conversations I've had have come out of that natural difference of opinion or the cautiousness that they're exploring and how
Hmm.
incredulous they are about some of the outcomes that
Hmm.
are predicted. And what I found is that every company is a bit different. And so as you start to drill into their specific world, their specific competitive landscape, uh, their specific development and release pattern, and their specific ability to extract domain knowledge or innovation from its customer base. Once you drill into that level of specificity, there is usually some obvious low hanging fruit or concern that can get them started on that. And so instead of trying to gain belief in the bigger picture that, yes, everything is changing about your organization, you can narrow it down to the one, two, or three most obvious low hanging fruits of an organization, and that really just starts the ball moving. So they are starting to affect change. It's an obvious thing that, let's just say, everyone's going to agree needs to change, and then that will start to move you down the path where you've already loosened up that identity,
Hmm.
right? maybe with some more easy to implement high return situations. That's where I do kind of a Gartner grid, like what's the top right? It's the most impactful and the easiest to execute on. Once you pick those, it just nudges the organization in that direction, and I do find that they typically start to lose that identity, hold on identity.
So Mike, a few weeks ago, I used Block and several other companies to bring up and actually many articles in the Wall Street Journal related to the AI hype in the market, where companies, organizations are taking the opportunity to downsize and then using AI as an example,
Yeah.
or a catalyst, right? And so, are in your conversations that you're having with different CEOs, are you seeing that there's recognition that some people are using AI as the opportunity and the excuse, opposed to the reality of what they may believe their company is able to transition to?
Yeah. I think the answer to that lies fundamentally in the gap leaders are seeing between what the role is today,
Hmm.
and if we make that role, 80% automated,
Hmm.
how are we going to use 80% of their time? I don't
Hmm.
know how to repurpose this resource. And so I haven't heard a lot of companies using it as an opportunity to cull the herd, so to speak. I did speak to one resource margin constrained company that was going to take advantage of that, right? We're going to automate some stuff and then eliminate some headcount that'll bring our P&L back in line,
Hmm.
at least conceptually. But more often, I'm hearing from CEOs they want to know how to gain competitive advantage from this increased bandwidth, these
Hmm.
are now available resources. And so they're not even sure really how to do that yet, let
Hmm.
alone how to make the change from this is our current set of roles and our skills gap to
Hmm.
get to where we can start to add value. So we're really early in that from my conversations. But I think most people are just trying to figure out how to leverage it, not necessarily how to use it to, you know, create less expenses.
So let me put this forward to you. So, because you hit on the signal thing earlier,
Yeah.
and so it connects to something called weak, and to my point earlier, right? We try to bring up the research on this kind of stuff, and he identified research on organizational sense making, and so what you're saying, Mike, directly speaks to that. So he demonstrated that leaders do not perceive reality and then respond to it objectively. They construct a version of reality through retrospective interpretation and then respond to the version that they constructed, which means that when the market signals suggest that the old model is eroding, leaders inside that model are at least equipped to see it clearly because their sense making apparatus is built to confirm what they already believe.
Yeah. Right.
So you've written about how early traction is often misread, that the gap between a promising market signal and a truly scalable business is where most companies quietly lose ground.
Yeah.
So, how does the psychology of early validation distort decision making inside growth organizations? And what does it take to maintain intellectual honesty when the pressure to believe your own story is enormous?
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. The pressure is enormous. Um, and in the right culture, it's a culture of fail fast. If
Hmm.
you're early stage and you are about to make long-term investment decisions based on something, it is really prudent to double click on that and actually try to break it, right? However, that's not necessarily a muscle that many organizations have, established organizations. I've started companies, co-founded companies. I've worked for some that were on the verge of product market fit, some that were post. The more mature the company is, the less I've seen an interest in trying new things, understanding you're going to fail,
Hmm.
but the outcome is not the success. It's to take one step closer to how do we succeed.
Hmm.
So I guess the first part of the answer is it depends on the maturity of the company. Yeah. And then secondly, when you are in the midst of change, I think you need leaders that understand change. And for those that try to repurpose existing leadership that don't have a muscle for change, they're more of the here's how we operate with discipline. Leaders need to take a step back and say, do I have the right team? And if I don't, how do I augment them?
Hmm.
And that's a hard question because I don't think the answer is so black and white. I think it's muddled and gray.
So, Mike, do you think as the with the sense making, right? So they're taking action on what they believe the reality is, and that's often historical. That's often experiential.
Yeah.
Have you seen any leaders being successful with putting that aside to realign what the reality is in reality?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, currently, I mean, the market is dynamically changing. Right? We can even use tariff as an example. Tariffs were in place. Now some tariffs aren't. And companies are trying to make an assessment of what reality is. And some of them haven't been here before. Right. So that reality that they're pulling from isn't a match.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen it both ways. Um, I'll give you an example. I spoke to one CEO. Um, they're a platform that leverages machine learning, and they sell to pharmaceutical manufacturers. So heavily, heavily regulated. And he was of the belief that agentic AI and probabilistic in general AI does not work, is not compliant in this heavily regulated space.
Hmm.
And therefore they went down a machine learning path, which is
Hmm.
deterministic. And
Hmm.
so they're able to remain in compliance while still giving its customers added horsepower around, this new capability. I think he's dead on and being really realistic about it. And he's not getting overly excited about how to use agentic capabilities because he knows that space. That space isn't going to change. I think that's a really good constraint that he's put on the organization. And it makes a lot of sense for the market they serve.
Hmm.
Conversely, I spoke to a CEO of a platform that works in basically retail space and how to maximize, retail real estate, meaning like planograms and such like
Hmm.
that. It was
Hmm.
kind of an integrated retail uh, uh, s- uh, real estate management, and by real estate I mean shelves, not
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
not buildings.
Yeah.
Um, and so they've got a decent customer base, and as expected, this CEO is very cautious about where they're headed. However, I did kind of get the sense he was downplaying how disruptive new agentic capabilities could be, and hadn't really been following some of the trends of the bigger software companies, like say Salesforce, who's trying to protect their base by becoming something else. Right? They were
Hmm. Yeah.
an application layer. We know application layer is becoming a bit commoditized, but they do have this, what Salesforce does really well is this kind of integrated full workflow. And so workflows and data are critical to organizations, especially in pillar systems like ERP or CRM, et cetera. And this CEO of this technology wasn't aligned to where these bigger software vendors were going to think differently about it. It was a lot of the conversation was referencing a lot to what he knew, i.e., his customer base and what they do,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? But the question that hadn't been asked or answered is, well, how are they thinking differently? How's the customer thinking differently? And so that was my ultimate recommendation, was that you go outside of your own four walls to understand where your customer's at.
Well, and let me build on that
Yeah.
because you hit on something exactly I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah.
So there's something that you said in describing your work at ETQ
Yeah.
that I want to explore because it challenges one of the most deeply held assumptions in organizational leadership. You took strategic positioning directly into a live customer environment
Yeah.
rather than validating it theoretically. And you said the biggest value didn't come from confirming the proposition, but from what you discovered in the field.
Yeah.
And so that insight, that's the most powerful value, or the way that most powerful value propositions, right? They're forged in the field, opposed to being designed in the boardroom. And it's a direct challenge to what we see with many organizations, particularly from a board perspective, where they know the organization, they have such deeply rooted beliefs about it. And it relates to Chris Arglis's, who has spent decades studying the gap between what he called espoused theory and theory in use. So the theory in use is what their behavior actually reveals about what they believe, right? And
Yeah.
so, what is it about the distance between leadership's understanding of their market and what the field actually reveals that consistently produces misalignment? And in your experience, building go to market systems across multiple organizations, where does that misalignment create the most damage?
The misalignment between what leaders believe is reality versus what is your customer saying?
Well, what they believe the value, when they become so deeply committed to what they believe the value proposition is,
Mm.
opposed to understanding what that value proposition is from a customer perspective. So in the field,
Yeah. Um,
how do they become so misaligned?
yeah. I mean, so that's a great question. In my experience, including at ETQ, what I was doing was I was an entrepreneur. I was a startup guy within an established environment. And so
Hmm.
naturally, there is a different mindset there. And so, but I don't know that it's necessarily a mindset problem in my experience. I think people have objectives and they're busy and they're constantly trying to prioritize and they're constantly being asked for stuff from other parts of the organization. And so that was my experience. And so at the leadership level at the time, this was pre-acquisition, the board directive was to have the company meet the company metrics that they knew would get the valuation they wanted, right? And so there's this maniacal focus on that. And so when you introduce a new idea that is incremental to what exists, there was a lot of resistance, and rightfully so. I didn't necessarily take it personal, but there was a
Hmm.
lot of resistance because it was it was additional to what we were already trying to do, and people are really busy. So to
Hmm.
start to explore this, it really took me a while to get the executive backing from the various functions that I needed. The CEO was totally on board because he was starting to have acquisition talks. He
Hmm.
understood the value of defining this. But when I went to my marketing leader at the time she was great. She was also very amenable to it. She also had a kind of penchant for it. She liked doing this stuff. But when we got into the kind of past the go to market teams to the delivery and customer teams, that's when they've got a really heavy workload. And for me to get some resources to actually execute on this test, right? So here I am, I'm asking to disrupt things that are creating utilization, bill hours, customer satisfaction numbers. These are the things that I could tend to threaten by asking for help. So I did have to negotiate that. So what I do find is that leaders that have that tremendous pressure to produce the results they want, a deviation from standard is very threatening. It's threatening to their ability to hit numbers. So what I did do is negotiate that, and the first thing I had to do was to eliminate black and white. We're doing it my way, or we're not doing it at all. That wasn't going to succeed. But instead, I tried to articulate the value to the company to them, and then obviously tie it to them, right? And these are all shareholding executives.
Hmm.
So outcome of an acquisition should be really important to them. And so when I was able to kind of articulate why it was important to the company and how it could directly affect them, I then opened the door to say, okay, if you can't give me what I'm asking for, please help me solve the problem that exists. And through that, I was able to find various pockets of interest. Probably could not never have predicted that. But that's where I think leaders have this big gap is if it's working, why fix it? And so when you can surface above that noise and actually have a real reason for the change, then people will start
So, but like, what if, in the perspective of velocity, right? So you're affecting change, and even in the startup mode, and where most founders are so committed to what they perceive the product and the value of that product is. And to my earlier point about the market dynamics changing so quickly, when there's information coming from the field that may change what that value proposition is. How did the founders, how did the leadership handle that perception shift? I mean, it rattles what they believe versus what the market is actually saying the value is.
Yeah, great question. So I do find founders are typically far more flexible. They don't care about anything except succeeding. And whether that's a financial position or whether it's because they have a mission, they're trying to help people or companies, whatever their belief system is there, they're also highly adaptable in the ways you can get there.
Mhm,
If my mission statement is to, make the lives of 100,000 people better, I don't care how it gets done, right? My idea of get the way to get that done, I don't have so much stock in that. What I do have a lot of stock in is the outcome. So
okay.
founders aren't the greatest example of where that resistance is. What I do find is when leaders come from one environment that's a bit more fixed, and frankly, his or her job has been keeping people on that track to not let them deviate left or right. That's a
Mhm,
muscle that they have. And they will exercise that or flex that muscle instinctually. So it does have a lot to do with the leader and the mindset. So if you are trying to affect change and and I've seen leaders do this that are trying to affect change, which brings other leaders with them. Um, there's certain tactics you can do. Have you ever read the book Switch? It's by like the
mhm.
Heath or Heath brothers or something like that,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
right? And so they have a couple concepts in there that I've put into practice, but I've seen also by others put into practice, right? And one of the principles there is to shrink the change,
Mhm,
right? What is the smallest possible change you can make that will have a measurable outcome in the quickest amount of time?
mhm,
Right? And so I think when you make the change not so dramatic and
mhm,
it's just small shifts every day,
mhm,
that's where
mhm,
I see leaders actually start to embrace it a lot more
mhm.
if they don't come from that kind of change management back.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually something that I have practiced over the years, and it was a lesson I learned in practice, working with very large, complex organizations, and like you being the entrepreneurial guy that was brought in to affect major transformation, and I learned that it was better and more productive to release things slowly. And even though the vision would be in my mind, that I couldn't share that vision in its entirety. I couldn't even share the end result of where we were going and when. For periods where I had done that, there was significant resistance because they went from 0 to 90 very quickly mentally, but they couldn't see going from 1 mile an hour to 89. There was no in between on, okay, this is how we get there, despite explaining it, right? It was almost more than what they could handle.
Yeah. Yeah. Kevin, you're making me think of another thing that I think is really important in the midst of change, and this can help leadership or it can be strong leadership, kind of pushing it down. But you have to promote successes within an organization so others start to gain that belief we were talking about earlier,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
And so if you have a leadership gap where they're looking at things through their own lens, not through objective reality, but through their own lens, and they're not seeking out contrary opinions to test. They're not actively trying to test and challenge it. Right. In other words, they're looking for people to agree with them. Success stories for those that are affecting change do help move that needle to start to break down that resistance and that disbelief.
So, Mike, you've argued that continuous automation should be operationalized as a core organizational capacity rather than treated as a one-time transformation initiative.
Yeah.
That requires new roles, new structures, and teams embedded close to revenue and customer workflows.
Yeah.
So, what have you learned about how organizations build the kind of adaptive culture? Because you spoke about culture before, where
Yeah.
field intelligence actually reaches the people who need it. And where does that resistance to that kind of transparency come from?
Yeah. You got to have a communication strategy and a cadence at an organization. And fundamentally, that's where I go first to inject any change that needs to happen. So in times of high change, that cadence will be more frequent. And what I've personally done in the past is uh obviously to communicate what's changing this week. What do we need to do differently this week? Um, and also, what have we been changing over the last 2 weeks? Therefore, we can come back and say, is the change sticking? Is it working? Sometimes you can accelerate that because the change you wanted had like immediate positive results and people just start, eating it up and they run with it. In other cases, you need to like, okay, I can't introduce something new today because this one didn't stick.
Mhm,
But you are
mhm.
looking for like right on that edge where it's like it's almost too much but it can be swallowed. So
Mhm.
creating that pace, and I think when people start to embrace that pace, you're going to see change be adapted, and adopted really much sooner.
So, do you see a change, Mike? And part of the question was really around those people that are more in line with engaging with the customer.
Yeah,
But one of I not to ask because I always ask two questions that are too complex, but so, talking about millennials, a lot of the research now shows that millennials are the ones who are leading most AI implementations
yeah,
because they're in that middle management layer that is just trying to help their team along and then meet the demands that are coming from above them for that change and transformation, that adaptation to a new technology. Are you in your experience, do you see that are there differences in that communication with how those things are being received dependent on where you are within an organization?
in terms of what your title or seniority is, and
Yeah, like if you're more adept at so you're hearing the customer complaints, you're hearing the potentially customer accolades every day.
yeah,
And they likely, because they're having that experience, may be more open to change. Or in the middle management, upper management layers, you have people who are more aligned to this is how I run my department, this is how I run my team.
yeah,
Do you see differences in the necessity for communication?
yeah, absolutely. And look, so let me preface it with this: if you are a leader and you are not acknowledging that we're in a period of tremendous change, right? Not to hype it up, but we are going through tremendous change, and
Mhm.
a lot of questions are left unanswered at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the reality. So, uh, not I don't really know how to help people that can, at minimum, acknowledge that we're in a period of tremendous change, right? And with whatever level uh, of hype that you want to apply to it, from 0 to 100, go for it. But we are in the period. We are in the midst of change.
Mhm, mhm.
I'll start with that. So let's assume that we're talking only about people that at least recognize we're in a period of change. That dynamic between, let's call it generations, and perhaps it's not a generational thing. It's where you sit in the organization and what your perceived uh, your perceived role is. Right? We all,
Mhm.
you know. Uh, I think a leader who is not as technology sound as perhaps the generation after him or her, there's still the need for strong business acumen and fundamentals. And so, if someone is exploring innovation and has a knack for that, they're going to tend to be very creative, and that's important. And if I had someone working for me that was in charge of an AI implementation, and let's just call him or her a millennial. It doesn't. I don't think it's necessarily a generational thing. I think it's a where you are in your career thing, which obviously correlate. I'm giving that person more rope because they've maybe grown up in an environment where that stuff's just more native to them, whereas I'm trying to like process it through my Gen X brain to give them that freedom, but I would be the steward of outcomes. So that is the way that I could coach and mentor a person that has a stronger technical capability than I do, is to still bring
Mhm.
them back to what is the outcomes and then test their resolve and their belief to achieve those outcomes with what they're saying. And
Mhm.
obviously that gives them a lot of freedom and creativity, so they're gonna dive deep into that knowing that I couldn't match their skills there. Yet they will also respect and appreciate when I bring them back to what does success look like and how are we gonna achieve that? Because at the end of the day, a fun project that doesn't have outcomes isn't gonna be good for them.
Right,
And
right.
so they tend to really start to appreciate that I'm looking out for our mutual success.
Cool. So, Mike, I wanted this is the last question. So, I want to close with the question that I ask every guest,
Yeah.
and I want to frame it specifically around your unique vantage point.
Okay.
You've been inside the pressures of scaling at Hypervent, at Content Raven during chaos of the startup phase, and at ETQ during international expansion.
Yeah.
Each of these contexts demands fundamentally different human operating systems, different decision making cadences, different relationships between leaders and teams, different tolerances for ambiguity and speed, and the ambiguity you just spoke to.
Yeah.
So, after 20 years of building inside those distinct pressure situations, what have you learned about organizational change that surprises people? And then, what do leaders consistently underestimate about the human side of growth and transformation? And then, more complexly, what would you tell a founder or CEO who's about to take their organization through a period of rapid scaling?
Yeah, great questions. All right, so oddly, it still surprises leaders as to the resistance they'll get. It just somehow they go into it with this vision, they stand behind it, they start kind of mandating we head in this direction. And that obviously does not push down responsibility and accountability to the and ownership, really ownership to the organization. So that's one thing that I think surprises is that the importance of driving ownership down to the team rather than trying to architect it and then dictate what people will do, and then holding them accountable to some level of activity that they haven't really signed up for
Yeah,
or
yeah,
that they
yeah.
don't believe in. So that
Yeah.
that's always surprises me. And it's not that they can't handle it because they once they recognize that that's the case, they usually course correct. But I just don't see it as the starting point for many leaders. So
So,
that's a little surprising.
so to just to build on that, Mike. So, have you seen? Let me ask it this way: to your point, if they're somewhat unprepared to recognize that what they're putting forward is resulting in resistance, And with the assumption that most leaders of mature organizations are coming with 10, 20, 30 years of experience, is there something now environmentally or from the market perspective that has dismissed or had them dismiss their own experience and feeling resistance in other situations?
It's a good question. I mean, it'd be speculative, because I haven't necessarily asked that question of the leaders where I saw them surprised, that there was resistance. I If I had a guess, there's there's a human element where you've got a vision and you're so excited to share that with everybody, and you've got what you think is the path to do it, but turns out it's just a bunch of ideas. Some are good, some
Hmm.
are bad. And you're so excited to get going, and you're so impatient to start that journey, that often will skip this early step to say, how do I architect a dialogue, not a statement,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? And that dialogue is going to result in something better than I can come up with myself.
Hmm.
So I don't know if it's excitement. I don't know. Maybe that's the pattern, but the root cause is different for leaders. Some are maybe ego driven, right? Which you got to kind of tone that down. Some is passion, just you're so excited about it, and like you just assume everyone's there.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of times, and I make this mistake often, and I have to constantly be on the lookout for it. But I assume people are where I am. I make this assumption that, um, informationally and emotionally, people are already where I am.
Hmm.
And so when people are here and you're starting here and you just go, you've never connected with anyone. They're still here at the bottom because you started a place they weren't. So I think that's another reason is people just internalize their own experience and then project that onto to everyone else, and that's such a human motion that it's hard to miss.
Hmm.
So that would be my speculation of where it is, and also my personal experience where I've met challenges in the midst of change.
Yeah, just to build on that, I have written so often over the years about active listening.
Mm,
And it confounds me sometimes where well, and we all do it. We all don't do it, I should say. Right? We get very excited about something. We make assumptions, and sometimes it's hard to take a pause. And I've seen leaders not do this of read the room, right? Of not taking a step back and saying, okay, is what I'm saying really resonating here? Or am I watching a bunch of head nods? Am I bunching a bunch of glassy eyed people? Or am I watching facial expressions that are begetting fear or even anger out of
yeah,
it? And there are people who just don't have that emotional intelligence to recognize that.
yeah, yeah.
So,
I think the challenge there, and this is, something I've experienced myself, is that it's sometimes really hard to remember that not everyone feels,
yeah,
uh, the way you do and interprets the world the way you
yeah,
do. It's really
yeah.
hard, right? And I go back to my earlier in my career, and this is always enough of a reminder for me to take a step back and understand people. But there was a point in my career where I avoided feedback because it felt like criticism.
Hmm.
It just felt like criticism, and I had this, like, overwhelming expectation of myself that I was gonna be the solution for everything, that
Hmm.
I was responsible for, versus my job is to shepherd this towards success and leverage my own skills when appropriate, but then, like, fill in your gaps. When you have gaps in your skill set, fill them in, and that's actually, until that started to feel like I was doing something unique and good, like, oh, I'm actually recognizing where I'm weak and I'm
Right,
pulling in
right,
help. That
right.
felt terrible in the beginning,
Yeah.
right? So that personal experience of where it's like, shit, I used to I used to avoid feedback because it felt so much like criticism. Now I've retrained my brain
Hmm.
to I feel naked without feedback. And that was really important in a startup culture and kind of what we were speaking about earlier, where it's like, well, how do you actually get to a point where you're like trying to prove yourself wrong versus the opposite, prove yourself right? And so
Hmm.
that is my personal kind of lighthouse that I will always refer back to in these circumstances. To remember, I felt very differently about something that is somewhat of a superpower now, and that's actually true for active listening as well. So
Right.
I'm a, I've got a, I'm ADD, a massive ADD. So like my brain goes so fast and it serves me really well in some circumstances and really poorly in others. And I've
Yeah.
mentioned one, which is where my brain's here and the group is, I haven't even introduced the subject yet. And
Yeah.
I'm like already taking off with all the things all the ideas and the work streams that are in my head.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And certainly, I think the criticism piece falls into that. But fundamentally, that's what I think it is really important is to realize that you've got a variety of states people are in, and really take that step back and recognize, go into the conversation knowing some people are feeling very unclear. Some people are worried about their job. Some people are like overly excited about this and about to spend 39 of their 40-hour work week doing stuff that doesn't matter because they're too excited about it. So you just have to recognize that everybody's there and more systematically introduce the ideas and the change. And then you start getting that snowball.
All right, Mike, that's all the questions I have. So I was just want to thank you for being on the Human Factor podcast.
Yeah, brother, this was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
I want to close by connecting what Mike has shared to the broader arc of the season. Every guest we have had has illuminated a different dimension of why transformation fails at the human level. We have examined the organization immune system, the psychological contracts that bind people to the status quo, the governance structures that neutralize change, the structural silence that prevents leadership from hearing what it most needs to hear, and the patterns that repeat across organizations regardless of size or industry focus. What Mike has shown us today is something different. He has shown us what happens when transformation is not imposed from outside by crisis or decline, but transformation demanded from inside by prior and the current success. Growth itself is a transformation engine, and it creates human dynamics that are among the most intense and least understood in organizational life. The psychological contracts that break when the organization outgrows what it promised. The identity crisis that occurs when the thing that made the organization special stops being so special. The cognitive biases that distort how leaders read their own success. And the structural distance between the field and the boardroom that ensures the information leadership most need is the information it's less likely to receive. If your organization is growing, these dynamics are active right now. The question is not whether they exist. The question is whether you can see them before they become the constraints that prevent your next stage of evolution. If you found today's episode valuable, subscribe to the Human Factor podcast wherever you watch or listen to podcasts. Leave a rating and a comment and share this episode with your leadership team. Subscribe to the Ideas and Innovations newsletter at 2040digital.com or on Substack for weekly frameworks and research on why change succeeds or fails. Connect with me on LinkedIn, where I post regularly about the psychology of transformation. Until then, remember, transformation doesn't fail because of the technology, strategy, or the market conditions. It fails because of people. And the more deeply you understand the human factor, the more likely your change or transformation is to succeed. I'm Kevin Novak. Thanks for watching or listening.